Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. We're really happy to have you join us for this webinar. This is the Library Instruction Roundtable Teaching, Learning, and Technology Committee Spring 2017 webinar series. And you are at the third in a series of 3 webinars that explore digital pedagogy from various perspectives. This session will cover best practices in assessment. So today our first presentation is called Assessing the First Year Experience Using PhotoVoice and Google Slides as a Digital Learning Tool. And this is going to be presented by Raymond, who is the first year student success librarian at Cal State University, Fresno. He is charged to coordinate first year information literacy and first year library experience program across campus. Previously, he has worked at NYU Shanghai and the New York Public Library. And our second presentation is called Measuring the Effectiveness of LibGuides with User Experience. And that's coming to us from Kaitlin Springmier, who is the resident librarian for online learning at the University of Chicago. She leads the development and promotion of e-learning initiatives there. He also serves as a leader for ACRL's residency interest group, which supports, promotes, and researches developments in library residency. So without further ado, we'll kick this off and get things started. And thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. Happy Friday. I'd like to extend my thanks to the TLT committee. So Joe for the introduction, Alyssa, Cynthia, Mandy, and Kenneth, and Amy, and everyone here for attending this webinar. I believe hopefully you'll be able to take some of it into your own practice and adopt it into however you prefer, whether it's instruction, whether it is teaching and learning, whether it is user experience assessment. There's a lot of really opportunities out there to develop these kinds of projects. And I'm going to share one of them with you today. So again, the introduction is looking at first year experience, my role as the first year student success librarian, focusing on user experience, but also teaching and learning and incorporating digital tools to assess the first year experience. So about my role, just to give you some background, I am a first year student success librarian faculty. So that means I am actively working closely with students and faculty in instruction, student engagement, and assessment. And one of my areas has been really focusing on high impact practices, which is defined by the American Universities and Colleges Association. And there are a series of them. And how do we integrate these kinds of high impact practices, such as service learning, first year seminars, and maybe collaborative learning and so forth into student success? How can we define and support student success? So one of the things is I'm really interested in looking at how the first year students at Fresno State, they utilize the library in a way that makes me understand their research behaviors, what they know or don't know about the library, and exactly where do they go in the library. So it's really interesting because I've designed a lot of user experiences, but they also tie into an instruction approach. And then I'll share some of that, how you can incorporate it into a one-shot possibly. So what I have been able to do is apply these visual techniques. I'll show actually not just one, but 2 examples. I know I mentioned PhotoVoice as one of them. There's actually another one, bonus for all of you for coming to this webinar. You get a second objective learning tool that I'm going to be doing, and to assess how students use the libraries and then their usages and their learning abilities as well. And most importantly, I'm interested in building those relationships with these students, the first year students, in addressing new services that we have for them, as well as what we can do to enhance our own services to really cater to their needs, because we all know first year students are very different from graduate students than transfer students and international students. And we need to be mindful of that because they have certain kind of needs, particularly at Fresno State, where our focus is really on student retention, as we have a lot of statistics that demonstrate that if the first year is really key to enabling students to continue going on in their education if we provide those and prepare them for those tools and equipment and services that meet their needs. And most importantly, promoting the resources that we have currently and developing those learning communities. So that's also another high impact practice by bringing students together, almost like a focus group, but then also discussing it in a way that's creative, fun, and also engaging. So, but most importantly, it comes down to empowering the first year students by giving them the voice to really understand that the library is their workspace, it belongs to them, but also that they can make changes too, that we're not just a huge institution and that they just have to find out about the rules and policies, but we're here to support their needs and learning services and so forth. So it's something to keep in mind, and how PhotoVoice as a conceptual technique can also address this kind of concern, which is something I'll be talking about. So what is PhotoVoice? Has anyone used or heard of it before? So feel free to type it in the chat box. You can say yes or no, or if you have some ideas, you're welcome to share it. I have heard of it, but not used it. No, I haven't. No. Okay. No, I didn't expect a lot of people to not have heard of it or used it. So that's great. So for the majority of you who answered and you are not familiar with it, I'm going to explain what it is. So PhotoVoice is actually a process in which people, usually those with limited power due to poverty, language, etc., use video or photo images to capture aspects of their environment and experiences and share them with others. So this actually came down from an anthropological study I've seen where, for example, the anthropologist, I forget which institution, he conducted research on homelessness, and he was interested in how and where homeless people were moving around the city. What were their sort of visions, and what were they seeing? Where were they going for resources or services? What were their challenges or roadblocks? So he gave them cameras, disposable cameras. He gave them about a week, in advance, and then they all met up, and then they processed the photos. And then he was able to see exactly what they were able to see, which is they went here instead, they went there. So it's a qualitative approach to address basically the types of qualitative feedback that you can get. What are people seeing that you aren't able to see, and how you're able to really look at their perspective. I think that's really key. So the pictures can then be used, with captions composed by photographers to bring the realities of the photographers' lives to public and policymakers, and possibly to make changes. So this kind of description was I used from the University of Kansas, which is very active in community engagement and looking at how PhotoVoice can be that kind of technique to enable and empower those with marginalized voices. So this goes back to exactly what I was saying about the first year students. They typically are the ones that people are not necessarily really too focused on, but now we're seeing a trend, and we need to continue assessing how first year students are utilizing resources on campus beyond just the library. So integrating into library instruction. So this is what I've been doing for the past year. So I've used Google Slides. I think most of you are familiar with it. If you haven't, please, you should take some time to explore it. It's a product from Google which allows you to collaborate, including there's Google Docs and so forth. But Google Slides particularly, you can create slides and share them with others, and people can also add slides, content as well, and it's free. So one of the things is I gather first year students in our first year student advisory group for the library. And basically I set up key prompts, and I address to them what they're supposed to do during the week. They're supposed to tell me exactly the basics, like who, what, when, where, and why in terms of the resources, and get them to think about library services and how they frame their images and experiences. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what I did. So the first year students, what's interesting is that they often have difficulty retaining information and text, as we all know, but through visual aids, through this kind of peer learning where other students are taking pictures of the library and then discussing it and sharing with it, really enforces and reinforces the services that we have for first year students. So this is what happened. During the focus group, we had about 4 students, and there was a lot of discussions and the images. So I gave them 1 week to really look at the Google Slides and had different prompts, like what is your favorite study area? What isn't working for you? Why are you in the library today at night? And then basically they took pictures. They didn't even have to say anything. They just took pictures, and then we were able to look at it in the group again, as a group, and discuss it. So what's interesting is that librarians and students learn more about different research information needs and studying preferences. Like I learned more about why they chose certain areas, and then they also learn that oh, there's a couch actually right here in the basement, and then they end up knowing more about these little details. And what's interesting for me is figuring out what works and what doesn't work in the library for the first year students, and then sharing information, obviously what we actually have, not necessarily correcting them, but also giving them the idea that we actually have this resource instead if you're having trouble, and really helping and building new knowledge. So through this sort of visual lens and helping them to see what I see, but also for me to hear what they're looking at as well. So here's the example of the Google slide prompt I used. So it's called Library Experiences PhotoVoice. This was done in November for about a week and a half. And so I asked, I put this direction up after I made explanation. Take pictures, different days, no explanation needed, no right or wrong either. So that means there is no right or wrong answer. They just go in, they just share what they see, and then we'll talk about it later. So this is one of the first prompt. Where is your favorite place to study? Take 3 pictures during different days and add them in there. Obviously, you can get really sophisticated. You can get really more specific if you want, or detailed, but I just wanted to see what they would say. So here's obviously C. This is a student, a first-year student. She had talked about her favorite place in the morning. It's Starbucks. It's in the library. So that's no shocker. And for those of you who have students who have this sort of a service, all your students are going to gravitate towards this kind of service. And when we had this discussion, she said, oh, but the lines are so long, and then Starbucks, they don't open past 9 p.m. So that's something for us to think about. Like maybe we should be thinking about opening Starbucks towards the end of the, because the library opens till 12 a.m. and it should open past that, like past 9 p.m. so that it serves our students. But that's something, that we have to be discussing further. And yes, that's really no surprise there that students are interested in this kind of service. And what's interesting is that we can also create more programs and events and give Starbucks gift cards. So if we know that a lot of students, particularly first-year students, are going to these vendors and so forth, then we know that we can entice them more with a Starbucks gift card. And then this is her favorite study place in the afternoon. She actually, for some reason, has access to the Graduate Study Center, which is something we had to discuss because I didn't know. It's actually only for graduate students, but she goes in there because it's quiet. But I think she told me it was probably her boyfriend who's a graduate student or something. So I'm trying to remember because it was a while back. But it was really interesting to hear why she would go to this place and nowhere else. And then here is Jimmy, who is another first-year student. What service in the library do you go to the most? It's no surprise, it's printing. And then I asked him, well, are there any challenges with printing? And he said, yes, the lines are too long in the beginning of the semester. That's not necessarily something new, but for us, if we know first-year students are actually printing stuff, then we need to think about how we can sort of reconfigure that kind of mindset so that they don't feel kind of overwhelmed with first-year experience, and then they have to print stuff and so forth. So Jimmy obviously pointed something directly, but I also told him that he can also print wirelessly and pick it up in other places such as the campus IT room or this other part of the building so that he doesn't have to wait, so that he's able to share that information with his friends, word of mouth, or with his classmates too. So that's something that we want to build on, this sort of a in-person relationship for them to understand that there are all these kinds of opportunities, not just, obviously we don't want to we're not necessarily driving them away from the library, but we're reinforcing that we have this service, but there are also alternatives too for you to think about. And this was interesting. So I asked about this question to C again, and then she posted this picture. What service in the library do you go to the most? And for those of you who are familiar with these kinds of cabinets and the way they're set up, you're probably thinking they're either maps or government documents. They're actually microfilm, right? And then I was curious, why would a first-year student use microfilms? Is it for history or English, or why would you use it? And then I asked her, I probed, and then she said she uses it because she is in the newspaper. She's in the college newspaper, and she needs to look up some of the historical research, what's already been done, and that these aren't digitized. So that gives me this idea that maybe we should start thinking about digitizing our own collection to be posted in an institutional repository or some sort of a service. Because if a student like that is still using these resources and she's always having trouble using the microphones, we need to think about, well, what is it that's really engaging for supporting students in terms of the extracurricular needs and also supporting our own campus mission. So that was really interesting. And I thought, okay, wow, I had no idea that people still use microfilm, like especially what purpose. And then I realized it's really for her activities and for her own work as a student journalist for our college newspaper. And so those are just examples of some of the things that the students wrote about. And I really want to just emphasize again, the goal of PhotoVoice, which is actually to provide a voice for those who have none, to instill critical consciousness, and to influence policy. So these kinds of conceptual and applied approach, really, we want to think about how we can empower our first year students and give them a voice and really understand this role that they can have in terms of influencing policy, whether it could be collection, like you saw earlier with the microforms, or with the services, or with any kind of spacing issues. Because I did have another prompt that asked, what is not working for you? And then people have taken pictures of these signage that's confusing, and also the spacing without a couch or a chair. So those are the things that we were able to think about and rectify easily. But I think it's important to know that, you know, this is a process that takes time, right? Like the students might expect changes right away, but we also have to inform them that, you know, this is really good qualitative information for us to assess and evaluate where the library should be doing, what they should be doing to support first year students. So, but really to instill this critical consciousness that they should be aware that there are such services. And then all the other students were sharing their ideas and said, oh, I didn't know you're part of the college newspaper. I always wanted to join. And they were able to talk at the end on how to become a member of that and contribute to that. So that is a good way to really build those relationships amongst themselves, and also for me to continue working with first year students. And you can easily do that in a number of ways, as I mentioned, through Google Slides, forming a focus group, and even in a one-shot, if you decided to do, if it's a more than one shot, it's like multiple ones, and then you have a discussion. And I think for a first year seminar, it would work really well, as opposed to maybe something that's focused on composition or communication first year level, because a first year seminar can be really open. We have one at Fresno State, we call it University One, and I'm sure most of you in your institutions have something similar. But if you also teach a one shot, like a credit class, a library instruction class, you can definitely embed this in there. So the applications, as I mentioned, you can go really creative. You can use Pinterest, Snapchat, Twitter, or other social media tools for instruction and engagement. So I've been trying, and I'm going to do it this semester, to have students send me pictures through Snapchat. So it's more real time. And for those who are not familiar with Snapchat, it is a really popular social media app where you can share selfies and pictures. It's mostly an image-driven app, and it just went IPO recently, so it's going to get more hits and interest in terms of institutional outreach and promotion. So what's interesting is that I can send the Snapchat to a whole bunch of the groups of students and say, where are you studying right now? And take a picture of it. And then they can just easily Snapchat it with me. The one interesting thing about Snapchat is that it does not save the pictures unless you do it yourself, but you usually get about 5 seconds to do it. Yes, cell phones work as well. I have yet to see a student without a cell phone. That is a great question. So a lot of students, they can obviously, we can do this in a more personal level. They can send texts and images. I've only sent my phone number to a few students in case they really needed it, my student workers. But generally, I don't like send it because how else would you communicate? But through these apps, it might be more, there might be this sort of approach to mediate. Twitter is a good one. Unless there is another approach to sending out the cell phone or email on the phone. Yes, that's a good one, Barbara. So I think what is interesting is that the Google Slides, you can send images through your phone to that application, the Google Slides product. So that's one way to do that. And also embedding in the one-shots. So you may have students do a scavenger hunt in the library and then share it later in Google Slides. Like if it's for an orientation or it's to introduce the library services, and it's really like how to find resources. You can have students go out of their ways and take pictures and then add it into the slide, and then we'll discuss it later. So you would have to set up the prompts, and then they would just follow through. And for an online instruction, what's interesting is that you can have first-year students visit the library and then take pictures if they can make time, and then discuss it in an online environment, and then share it on Google Slides so that everyone can see. So there are really great ways to apply this approach to library instruction. And I'm just sharing a few tips, and hopefully that will give you some ideas on what it is that you could do to enhance user experience, to find out more about first-year students, and also to really develop these kinds of really cool assessments using visual aids and so forth. And what is interesting is that I'm going to talk about this other piece that I've been working on, which is a visual technique called ethnomapping. So for everyone here, feel free to answer this question. Has anyone heard or used this technique before? Yes and no, maybe heard of it. Okay, great. I'm going to let a few more people type their responses. No, okay, yes. I think I'm going to try PhotoVoice before some of our first year orientation classes come in. Yes, heard of ethnomapping. Okay. I always forget is if there's a hyphen there or not, and it looks like there's a disagreement in this literature, how they spell it. Some knowledge of ethnomapping. Okay, no, okay, great. So for those of you who are familiar, great. So this is sort of a way to engage first year students that's not completely news for you, but I'll share the case study at Fresno State. And for those who are not familiar with it, this will be another interesting way to engage and interact with first year students, or any students really, to understand where they're coming from and what they're learning. So as I mentioned, this is the second part of the presentation, which I wanted to include because it's so exciting, it's so cool, and I just tested it, before this chat, like about a month ago with my first year students, and it worked out really well. So for those who are not familiar with it, ethnomapping, ethnography, which is the study, an anthropological study where you observe and collect data through observations of, and I should say that it's a really good technique. A lot of anthropologists use this. And the mapping part is basically using maps to frame and reflect understanding and discussion. So ethnography is really a holistic approach to research developed by anthropologists in order to understand people within their social and cultural contexts. So it's interesting because you're combining the two using mapping as a activity to figure out what students know or don't know about the library. And what happened was that we had students, these are some of the students, they had to draw a map of the library. And when they had to draw a map of the library, I specifically said, just draw the map of the library any way you like. Some people actually drew like the services, which is what I really wanted to see. And some of them were so detailed that I knew this person was going to the library every day. And some people did not draw it so much. And it's interesting because I asked them, you could see the different maps. I asked them, what is it that, I'm just curious why, why isn't as detailed, right? I'm not like maybe questioning why they're not studious or anything. I'm just curious. And then they tell me they're actually a commuter student. They have another job. They don't study in the library. They normally go to other places to study. So that gives me some ideas on where are other students studying if they're not studying in the library. And those who are detailed, they tell me exactly where they're studying, what is really useful for them, a space, and so forth. And then we compare notes. We actually have all these 5 students, or yeah, about 5 students, draw the maps and then share it with one another, pass it along, and then identify the differences and then the similarities. And then they sort of correct each other. And then they sort of also address, oh, this isn't, it's not called tablet services. There's a specific name. It's called Discover E, which is in the library that we support in terms of app research and using different research apps and so forth. So what's interesting is that they end up sharing these knowledge, and then they have these really interesting conversations. And the application to library instruction is that you can have first year students draw what the library is like, after a week of spending time there, share it and discuss it in groups. Then you can sort of map out learning concepts in selected resources. So basically to discuss what it is that they could get out of these resources, print resources, or just services. And then, for instance, maybe reference materials that are on the site. What are they good for versus the scholarly journals that are online? Why should they consult with one of these resources, and where would they do it? And we have a section called Hot Topics, which is really for books on like global warming, on gender inequality, these kinds of topics that are important in social and political matters. And we often have first-year students doing research on this. So we have students sort of, you can also have students discuss and compare these kinds of resources. You can engage with students about resources and services. Sometimes it's not about the research skills, but where to go and whom to ask for first-year students. So thinking about how we can enforce and instill this self-efficacy, this sense of belonging, where can first-year students really get those kinds of resources they need so that they know that who to ask and where to go. And what's interesting is that you can have students draw the maps and compare it and understand what is it that they know or didn't know, as I was alluding to. And it gets even more interesting because you can also do it on the library website. So that's something I'm going to be testing out soon. Having them draw the library website and then try to see what it is that they've used or haven't used. And then we get together and talk about it and show them what it is that's out there. And then from there, you can understand, this is almost like a heat mapping process, right? You're doing an assessment, but you're also educating them. And then you're also having them share with one another that maybe they didn't know that they can book a study room. And I'm curious to see what's going to happen, and I'm going to do it later today. Or maybe they didn't know that there are other resources out there. So that's going to be really, really a good approach to assess your own usability testings, but also just having them discuss with one another. And you can do this in a one shot, I think, before you even have students take out the laptops and then follow you along. They can actually draw it out and then discuss it. So I hope those are some of the techniques that you can really take back. And I'm really excited because they're new for me, and I'm always trying to innovate and try new things and learn more about our first year students, because I think it's so important that we always need to focus on the big pictures, but also focus on those that are typically marginalized or just forgotten in this big pool of academia. So I'm happy to accept any questions down the line. If you want to email me, please feel free to go ahead, or tweet me. I'm really quite responsive and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ray. That was great way to reach out and get student feedback, and really good. A couple things I forgot to mention up top before Kaitlin speaks here is that, one, we will be having a question session after she speaks, and we can deal with some of the questions that have either come in through the chat or also at that time some more questions. So I wanted to mention that. Also, this is being recorded, so it will be up on the website later as far as some things like URLs and other things you may want to get to later. So great. So we'll move on next with Kaitlin, and talk to you later.
Great. Hello, can everyone hear me? Wonderful, wonderful. So it looks like my slides came up perfectly. So just wanted to thank everyone with LIRT for hosting this. And today I'm going to be talking about assessing library guides with some user experience principles. So as Joe said earlier, my name is Kaitlin Springmier. I'm a resident librarian for online learning at the University of Chicago. And at Chicago, I've been working with our subject specialists and reference librarians to assess and redesign their guides. So today I'm going to be talking about library guides and how we can adapt some user experience research to learn more about how our students are interacting with our guides and what they want to see in our library guides. So first, I just wanted to go through a little background on the development of library guides. Here is a picture of a Pathfinder from 1983. We've actually been creating guides since the 1950s. First, it was book lists or bibliographies of recommended readings on a particular topic. And then in the 1970s, librarians at MIT coined the term Pathfinder, where they marketed and sold guides to other librarians as research tools. This wasn't a very successful venture because librarians like to customize guides for their own resources. And because each librarian was customizing their own guides, they tended to vary greatly, but their existence overall allowed librarians to expand knowledge and service beyond a face-to-face meeting or interaction at a reference desk. So as libraries evolved, Pathfinders then evolved and turned into research guides on web pages, and these web pages would provide links to reference materials, databases, journals, and websites in a discipline usually. These lists quickly grew in length and could be narrow or gross in scope. You can see on this slide, this is a screenshot from a legacy guide from our MAPS librarian at University of Chicago, and it's kind of hard to read, but the guide itself is very, very long and filled with jargon, but one of the most common problems, which is definitely occurring on this page, is that a lot of the links are broken due to link rot or just pages going away. So then in 2007, Springshare's LibGuides launched, and since its launch, this cloud service has experienced widespread international adoption. This quote from Aaron Bowen really, I think, accurately summarizes the platform's growth and expansion. And he says that it has become increasingly dominated but under-researched position in the academic library world for delivering guides and tutorials. And we know that if these guides are designed well, they can support learning by supplementing or even replacing in-person instruction. But because LibGuides have such a design flexibility and shallow learning curve, there's a wide gamut of structure and design, and the disparity can make finding resources or starting a research project more confusing for students a lot of the time. So a recent review of usability and design literature identifies some design issues that happen in library guides. I'm going to run through these issues with some guides that I found on Springshare's community site. It's not to say that the examples are bad, but rather the design could be improved. So the first one here is an inconsistent design from page to page or guide to guide. So we can see that guides from this institution have differences in some are 2-column guides and some are 3-column guides, and if a student is jumping around from guide to guide, they can get confused about the focus of the guide and how much content is on each page. Another design issue is confusing terminology or reliance on library jargon, which we saw in our screenshot of web pages before. This guide itself refers to a resource called Merlot, which experienced researchers in open education resources might know as a great database to search for open education resources, but for beginning researchers, some context would be very helpful in helping researchers start this. Another design issue is cluttered pages that lack a focal point. This page on the history of science provides a lot of resources for performing research on the history of science, but it doesn't direct users to start in any particular place, so it could be confusing to find which resource is right for you on this page. Another design issue is too much content, or the content is not appropriately scoped for the task at hand. So the main page on this guide for environmental research is all about the library rather than environmental research. You can see it shows some study zone availability spaces, so it's not really appropriately scoped. If someone lands on this page looking for environmental research, they might navigate away pretty quickly. And finally, oh, sorry, I got a couple more. Hard to recognize navigation is another one. LibGuides allow us to really put headers and footers, so it maintains consistency with our library website. But it can make navigation a little bit difficult in library guides. So in this one, we can see there's multiple navigation. Do I stay up top or do I go to the left? So just being consistent with navigation or making it really clear in your guides is important. And now finally, a design issue is excessive tabs in the navigation menu. Too many tabs can make for a confusing and overwhelming guide for users, so make sure that you do keep those tabs concise. User experience research can help us understand how our patrons find and use our guides, and by gathering and implementing this input, we can create more effective, instructional, helpful, and most importantly, used guides. So the UX research and design today that I am focusing on is greatly informed by Aaron Schmidt and Amanda Etcher's book, Useful, Usable, Desirable, Applying User Experience Design in Your Library. It's a very digestible, easy to read book for someone just getting started in user experience research. They have this principle, one of their main principles is that user experience design is that the user is not broken, it's the thing, meaning that if someone has to be taught how to use something, then that thing is broken. As instruction librarians, this might sound a little silly. A primary part of our job is to teach students how to use information from a variety of resources, which requires usually at least some basic instruction. However, this doesn't mean that we should teach students how to use guides to these sources. If we take philosophy that library guides serve as a reference after the librarian has left the classroom or as a supplement to a librarian in a classroom, we really have to design these guides that are intuitive to our students. So user experience design is usually focused on digitally designing sites according to users' pathways, meaning how they navigate to the resource, preferences, meaning how they see information displayed, and intention, meaning the overall purpose of the library guide. Because user experience design is focused on designing for specific populations, this webinar is not going to provide universal recommendations for library guides design. Rather, it's going to give knowledge and tools for you to perform your own user experience research for your library guides. So before you begin your research, you first must need to identify the problem of your guide or find a problem to solve. This can be done either through attitudinal or behavioral research. Attitudinal research is qualitative insights into users' thoughts, feelings, needs, attitudes, and motivations. The data from this research is usually obtained through conducting surveys, having informal conversations, or in my case, a lot of reference transactions. Behavioral research is quantitative data about how users actually interact with your library guide, and this data can be obtained through usability tests, click heat, or user navigation data. Springshare does provide creators with a small amount of behavioral research data. It can give you information on how many times your individual guides and pages were viewed. It can also give you information on the total number of guides number of times your guides were accessed by unique users, your user's browser preference, top search terms in your library guides, and the number of times users click certain assets in your guides. Anecdotally, for me, oopsies, let's go back. Here, the most useful for me is this guides data. Here we see a screenshot from a guide that I created for online orientation, which we see was very, very popular at the beginning of the year when it was advertised on social media and on the library's website. But I can also see through this guide these stats that our students weren't too interested in our library social media accounts. That's that last little bullet point. We had a total of 3 views in this academic year. So not something they were really interested in navigating to. So then if we move forward all the way, there's also Google Analytics. I don't know if anyone uses Google Analytics at their libraries. It is a great resource for more robust behavioral data. It can tell you how the user got to that page, as well as the average amount of time users spend on your page. I have a screenshot here from the Google Chrome plugin for Google Analytics. The top bar provides that average user data. And then there's a live page view that shows the frequency of time users are clicking links when they're on this page. So from Google Analytics, I learned that most of our students bounced out of this guide once they visited our Spaces tab. And they seem to be most interested in learning about library collections. And I've been able to use this data singularly to both revamp current orientation sessions content, and I'm also interested in seeing in comparing this data to our other library guides to learn more about users' overall guide navigation. Yes, so this is a Chrome plugin for the Google Analytics account. You have to have a Google Analytics account, and then you can add this Chrome plugin and log in to view your information. So after you've determined the problem with your library guide with attitudinal or behavioral data, the next step is to perform a content inventory of your guide. In a content inventory, you can list all the pages in your guide in a spreadsheet. It itemizes page information such as the name, the URL, the content, and the purpose. The content inventory is useful in the moment to understand the details of each page, but also as a historical record of how that page grew or shrank. Performing this step allows you to get a better understanding of everything that is in your guide as a holistic view. You can find things you didn't know existed, spot duplication, or identify new relationships. While you're working on your content inventory, ask yourself what information is crucial, what information is duplicated, what information can be deleted. And then after you do that content inventory, the third step is to rewrite and reorganize content. To be able to do this, you'll need to revamp your content based on what your students want out of your library guides, and understanding what your users want can be done through collecting that attitudinal data that we talked about before. There are many different ways you can collect this data. Some of the most popular tests performed by user experience researchers are the XO test, where participants are asked to mark up a printout of the library guide, circling the things they liked and crossing out things they didn't. Focus groups, where participants are letting guided discussions about how they find, access, and use guides. A 5-second test, where participants are asked to recall the guide's content after viewing it for 5 seconds. And a task scenario, where participants are asked to complete a number of tasks in the guide, and the survey leaders record the percentages of success or failure in completing those tasks. Most of these tests require that you perform the UX research in person or have certain technology to track users' clicks remotely. However, the 5-second test can be administered remotely with the least amount of technology. And so because of this, I am going to have you all be participants in a 5-second test today, just to kind of see how it works. So in the 5-second test, I will show you a screenshot of a newly designed library guide that I created using this user experience research. For 5 seconds, after those 5 seconds, we're going to launch an Adobe quiz and ask you 3 questions about the guide. So I'm going to share my, I'm actually going to show a screenshot. It says share my screen, but I'm going to show a screenshot now, and you'll have 5 seconds to look at it. Great, so now we should launch the quiz, and I think Alyssa is going to launch the quiz for us. Wonderful. And while you guys are answering these questions, I just want to talk a little bit more about why you would use a 5-second test, because it does seem like a very short time, but for a lot internet users, it's more than enough time for them to determine if there's enough, what the page is about. So if there's enough quality in your website to stay or to leave or maybe never to return. A critical driver of a page's success is the ability to deliver information quickly. So using this 5-second test allows you to understand what information a user is seeing and how you can most critically deliver important content. And let's see here. Looks like we've got some answers coming in. See that someone thought there was too much text. I know that the screenshot seemed a little small, and that's just part of the game of using a screenshot from for a Web Connect. I really like your idea, Ray. We can combine it with ethnomapping and have them see a site for 5 seconds and draw it out. I wonder what information you would really get out of that. Great. So we do have some answers still coming in. I'm just going to give us maybe one more minute to type your answers in, and then we can close the poll. Great. Great. So I'm just going to end the polls now. Thank you all for your participation. Ending the polls here. Great. Thanks so much for participating in that. I hope maybe I can use some of your feedback to continue to revamp this guide. But I just wanted to share a little bit about how this guide was developed. It is a revamp from previous guides on the library's website, and we did the revamp through user experience research. So again, we started with identifying a problem, and the problem identified was that library users had difficulty understanding the differences between our interlibrary loan services. We participate in 2 consortia, which were launched and branded separately, and then we also provide interlibrary loan. Each of these services had their own guide. So through attitudinal research, I identified that we were getting a lot of questions about the differences between these services. About 25% of our questions were related to clarifying what these services were or how one differed from another. And then through behavioral research, I kind of dug a little deeper and said, why do we keep getting these questions? I saw in our Google Analytics data that 54% of users on one delivery services guide had come from a prior guide about delivery services, and then 25 were going on to a third guide. So it means that users were kind of jumping from guide to guide, trying to draw connections and differences between these services. And research about how we use the internet shows that cognitive capacity and the ability to create memory breaks down when we're browsing the internet. So I began to work to consolidate these 3 guides into one guide. So first, I conducted a content inventory, and from the content inventory, I learned that much of the information on the pages is the same or similar. So doing that content inventory allowed me to take a total of 12 pages from 3 guides and bring it down to 4 pages on one guide. And then to rewrite and redesign the content, I reviewed some of our research that we had done on XO tests with library guides. And common themes that arose from that research were that our users liked guides when guides helped them answer specific questions or perform immediate tasks. And also users really liked video tutorials and intentional lists of links, especially when these links had contextual text. So then I recreated a guide and participated in a discussion with our library student advisory group to learn about what content they would really most like to see on a guide about library delivery services. And from this group, I learned that our students were using these services most frequently for required course texts. So they wanted to know information about delivery time, the length of loan, and options for renewals. So I made sure to include that content in the guide. And since this guide has been developed, our questions about delivery services has decreased immensely. It's down to a negligible amount. And this guide is also the 10th most viewed guide this academic year. So I chalk this one up to being a successful redesign of a library guide. And that is my content, so thank you very much. If you have questions, you can, I guess we'll take questions now. You can also contact me. It seems like I'm going to put my email right in this chat box in case you want to get a hold of me later. Okay, and I'll just let any questions come in if you have them.
Yes, I was going to jump in here real quick. Kaitlin, thanks so much. Great job. Really great, both Kaitlin and Ray here with some good deep dives into assessment, connecting up with students. Really enjoyed this. A lot of great information. So yeah, just reviewing back to at least one question I know that we may have missed for Ray, came in from Barbara. Let me see if I can get this in here into the chat box again. And I will let Ray jump in here with that one.
Hi, this is Ray again. Let me see. This is the question about, is it the cell phone photos? Just want to make sure I get that correct because there's a lot of text coming in. So I did just want to say that, yes, you can use different kinds of devices, cell phones, or tablets, definitely. And then the most important thing is regrouping and having everyone come together and talk to each other. That really brings that human connection that I think a lot of first-year students yearn for, and they need that connection to identify and really feel that sense of belonging. So I hope that answers your question. So there's some questions for Kaitlin as well. So I don't know if we should do this in order, or Joe, what would you like to do?
So let me jump in here because the one question that I put into the chat box was related to, do you have any usage guidance or rules? And I think this came from Barbara, if I have that right. It was also stated our college is very particular about privacy and there's no individual identification. So let's kind of start with that one first, and I'll try to work my way through some of the chat ones, and let's try that.
Sorry, Joe, was that for me or for Kaitlin?
That's for you, Ray.
Okay, so I just read guides and then I was thinking guidance and guides, but let me just reread this again. Do I have any usage guidance rules? That's right. There is, of course, a concern to make sure that we are aware and sensitive to privacy. So the students themselves, I mean, they're eager. The ones I selected. How did I select them? I teach a lot of workshops. I do a lot of one-on-one consultations, and then I go to some of the meetings and so forth, and able to connect with them and ask them if they're interested in joining the student group. So basically, their goal is to help me assess the library services for their first year experience. And so with the privacy part, obviously I told them very clearly that when they take pictures, do not take pictures of other people unless you ask for permission, and obviously only focus on spaces, signs, or services. So that's something that I am very mindful of. So any picture that does not include people, that's something that is fine. But if they obviously, I think one person took a picture of his friend, just looking or sleeping in the couch because it's just right there. That's fine as long as that person had permission. So this is we're collecting the data, but we're not like really collecting it. Like we're not storing it somewhere. This is just like a discussion, and it's for us to share and use it as a teaching and learning tool. So I hope that answers your question, Joe. There is another question here. Did the technology ever become a distraction during the activities, or did the students mostly stay on task? So that's a really good question. This is what happened. We had a meeting for 1 week, and I discussed the instruction, the guidance, like what they're supposed to do for that full week. And then we reconvened again the week after. And one out of the 4 students, or 3 students, couldn't really do all of them, but she still missed some. But the fact is that I think we were able to meet again to discuss it. She felt comfortable in doing it again, and we're going to be trying it again. So I think they've been really focused. I think if we apply something like Snapchat, they could get a little distracted without really thinking through like some of their photos. Like Snapchat is you just take it and then you kind of forget about it. So, but I think that's something to really consider. I think the technology can be obviously a distraction, but if we really focus on the certain goals of this project, then I think it'll be clearer to them. Thanks for your question.
Okay, thanks, Ray. As far as I can see within the chat box, currently there's no other questions. I hope I have not missed them. If someone sees one that I did, please jump in. But of course, we'll give everybody a few more minutes to type in some other questions for the presenter. Okay, I did want to add in that there is a link here that you can go to give us some feedback for the webinar, which obviously will help us with future topics. I'll give it just a little bit more time here in case people are still thinking through questions, but also will say thank you once again to the presenters. Great job here today. Thank you also to Alyssa for helping us out with some of the tech setup and everybody else on the LIRT TLT committee. And I guess I'll give it here till 1, maybe another extra minute. But thank you again for everyone attending, and have a good day.